Sarah Martinez never imagined that her decision to join the army would lead her to the dusty battlefields of Afghanistan. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had always been the girl who helped injured animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. But when her family faced financial struggles during her senior year of high school, the military seemed like the only path to pay for college. At 19, Sarah found herself in basic training, her long brown hair cut short, and her gentle nature hardened by weeks of rigorous preparation. She excelled in medical training, her natural instinct to heal making her one of the top combat medics in her unit. Her drill sergeant often said she had nerves of steel and a heart that refused to give up on anyone. Meanwhile, across the country in Ohio, Michael Thompson was making his own decision to serve. Unlike Sarah, Michael came from a military family. His father had served in Vietnam, and his grandfather in World War II. For Michael, joining the army felt like carrying on a family tradition. He was tall, with sandy brown hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to see everything around him. His specialty was communications, and he had a gift for staying calm under pressure. When both Sarah and Michael arrived at their forward operating base in Afghanistan, they were assigned to the same unit, the 25th Infantry Division. The base was located in a dangerous region where Taliban attacks were frequent, and every day brought new challenges. Sarah worked in the medical tent, treating everything from minor cuts to serious combat injuries. Michael managed communications between their base and headquarters, ensuring that vital information flowed smoothly even during the most chaotic moments. Their first meeting was brief but memorable. Sarah had been working a double shift in the medical tent when Michael arrived with a badly injured soldier. The young man had stepped on an improvised explosive device during a patrol, and his leg was severely damaged. As Michael helped carry the stretcher, Sarah noticed how gently he handled the wounded soldier, speaking words of comfort even though his own hands were shaking. "You're going to be okay," Michael whispered to the injured man. "Doc Martinez here is the best medic we have. She'll take good care of you." Sarah looked up briefly as she began working on the soldier's wounds. She caught Michael's eye for just a moment, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared purpose, of two people who understood the weight of responsibility they carried for their fellow soldiers. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Michael began to cross paths more frequently. The base was small and everyone knew everyone else. During rare quiet moments, they would find themselves sitting together in the mess hall or walking the perimeter during evening patrols. Sarah learned that Michael had a younger sister back home who was studying to be a teacher, and that he sent most of his military pay to help support his divorced mother. Michael discovered that Sarah carried photos of all the animals she had rescued as a child, and that she still dreamed of opening her own veterinary clinic someday. Their conversations were always interrupted by the harsh realities of war. Rocket attacks would send everyone scrambling for cover, and emergency medical calls would pull Sarah away at a moment's notice. But in those brief, stolen moments of peace, a friendship began to grow between them. The other soldiers on the base started to notice the connection between Sarah and Michael. During movie nights in the recreation tent, they would sit next to each other, sharing a bag of popcorn sent from home. When Sarah worked late shifts in the medical tent, Michael would often stop by with coffee and updates from the communications center. It wasn't romance in any traditional sense. There was no time or place for that in their dangerous environment. But it was something deeper. It was two souls recognizing each other across the chaos of war. Sarah's reputation as a medic grew stronger with each passing month. She had successfully treated dozens of wounded soldiers, often working under fire and in impossible conditions. Her commanding officer recommended her for a commendation, noting her exceptional bravery and skill. But Sarah never thought of herself as brave. She simply did what needed to be done, driven by her inability to watch others suffer when she had the skills to help. Michael, too, was earning recognition for his work. His ability to maintain communications during attacks had saved lives on multiple occasions. When other bases lost contact during firefights, Michael found ways to keep the lines open, ensuring that medical evacuations and reinforcements could be coordinated effectively. His calm voice over the radio became a source of comfort for soldiers across the region. As their deployment entered its 6th month, both Sarah and Michael had seen things that would stay with them forever. They had lost friends to roadside bombs and sniper attacks. They had witnessed the devastating effects of war on both soldiers and civilians. But they had also seen incredible acts of courage and compassion. They had watched young men and women risk their lives for strangers, and they had been part of missions that saved countless lives. The friendship between Sarah and Michael deepened through shared experiences that most people could never understand. They had both held dying soldiers in their arms, had both made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for others. They understood each other in a way that transcended words, connected by the unique bond that forms between people who have faced the ultimate test together. Neither of them spoke about what would happen when their deployment ended. The future seemed impossibly distant when each day brought new dangers and challenges. But in quiet moments, when the base was peaceful and the Afghan sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, they both began to hope that whatever lay ahead, they wouldn't have to face it alone. The stage was set for the moment that would change both their lives forever, a moment when Sarah's courage and Michael's fate would collide in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at the forward operating base. Sarah woke before dawn to prepare the medical tent for another day of treating soldiers with various injuries and illnesses. The routine had become second nature to her, checking supplies, reviewing patient charts, and ensuring that all emergency equipment was ready for immediate use. She had no way of knowing that this would be the day that would define the rest of her life. Michael had been working the night shift in the communications center, monitoring radio traffic from patrols across the region. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, he was preparing to hand over his duties to the day shift operator. Intelligence reports had been quiet overnight, suggesting that enemy activity in their area was minimal. It seemed like it might be one of the rare peaceful days that allowed everyone to catch up on rest and maintenance. At 0800 hours, Captain Rodriguez called a briefing for a routine patrol mission. A nearby village had requested medical assistance for several children who had fallen ill, and the unit was tasked with providing humanitarian aid while also gathering intelligence about Taliban movement in the area. It was exactly the kind of mission that reminded everyone why they were there, not just to fight, but to help protect innocent people caught in the middle of a complex conflict. Sarah was selected to accompany the patrol as the medic, along with her medical bag filled with antibiotics, bandages, and basic diagnostic equipment. Michael was assigned to the mission as the communications specialist, responsible for maintaining contact with the base and coordinating with other units in the area if needed. As they prepared their gear, neither Sarah nor Michael felt any particular sense of foreboding. They had been on dozens of similar missions over the past months. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers in 3 armored vehicles. Sarah rode in the second vehicle with Michael and 4 other soldiers, including Sergeant Martinez, no relation to Sarah, a veteran with 3 previous deployments who served as the patrol leader. The convoy followed a route that had been used many times before, winding through rocky terrain toward the village about 15 miles from their base. For the first hour of the journey, everything proceeded normally. The soldiers talked quietly among themselves, checking their equipment and discussing the medical supplies they were bringing to the village. Sarah reviewed her notes about common childhood illnesses in the region, while Michael monitored radio chatter from other patrols. The landscape outside was stark but beautiful, with rugged mountains rising against a crystal-clear blue sky. The explosion happened without warning at 0947 hours. A massive improvised explosive device hidden beneath the road surface detonated directly under the lead vehicle. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the entire armored truck into the air before slamming it back down in a twisted mass of metal. The second vehicle, carrying Sarah and Michael, was thrown sideways by the force of the explosion, rolling twice before coming to rest on its side. Sarah regained consciousness to the sound of gunfire and shouting. Blood was running down her face from a cut on her forehead, and her left shoulder felt like it was on fire. But her medical training immediately took over, and she began assessing her own injuries and those of the soldiers around her. Sergeant Martinez was unconscious with a severe head injury. 2 other soldiers were crying out in pain from broken bones and shrapnel wounds. Michael was trapped beneath a piece of the vehicle's internal structure, his right leg clearly broken and his face pale from shock and blood loss. He was conscious but struggling to breathe, and Sarah could see that he was going into shock from his injuries. The communications equipment was destroyed, meaning they had no way to call for help from the base. Outside the overturned vehicle, the situation was even more dire. Taliban fighters had initiated an ambush immediately after the IED explosion, firing from concealed positions in the rocks above the road. The soldiers from the third vehicle were trying to establish a defensive perimeter, but they were outnumbered and pinned down by heavy enemy fire. The lead vehicle's crew was either dead or severely wounded, unable to participate in the fight. Sarah made a quick decision that would haunt and define her for years to come. Despite her own injuries and the ongoing firefight, she began the dangerous process of extracting her fellow soldiers from the wreckage. She started with Sergeant Martinez, using her limited strength to drag his unconscious form to a position of relative safety behind the overturned vehicle. The effort sent waves of agony through her injured shoulder, but she ignored the pain. Next, she worked to free the two soldiers with broken bones, helping them crawl to safety while bullets flew overhead. Each trip back to the wreckage exposed her to enemy fire, but Sarah's focus was entirely on saving her fellow soldiers. She had taken an oath to preserve life, and nothing, not enemy fire, not her own injuries, not the very real possibility of death, was going to stop her from honoring that commitment. Michael watched in amazement as Sarah repeatedly risked her life to save others. Even in his state of shock and pain, he understood the incredible courage she was displaying. When she finally reached him, trapped beneath the twisted metal, he tried to convince her to leave him and get to safety herself. "Sarah, you need to go," he gasped, his breathing labored and shallow. "I'm pinned down good. Save yourself and the others." But Sarah had no intention of leaving anyone behind. She had already lost too many patients over the months of deployment, and she was not going to lose Michael. Not today, not ever. She began the painstaking process of moving the debris that trapped him, working with her one good arm while enemy bullets continued to strike the vehicle around them. The metal beam that pinned Michael's leg was incredibly heavy, and Sarah's injured shoulder made it nearly impossible to get the leverage she needed. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Inch by inch, she managed to shift the debris enough to begin pulling Michael free from the wreckage. As she worked, Michael used his training to try to assess their tactical situation. Through the pain and shock, he could hear that the firefight was intensifying. The Taliban fighters were getting bolder, advancing closer to their position. He knew that time was running out, and that Sarah's repeated exposure to enemy fire was going to get her killed if she didn't get to cover soon. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah succeeded in freeing Michael from the wreckage. She helped him crawl to the defensive position behind the overturned vehicle, where the other wounded soldiers were taking what shelter they could find. But even as they reached relative safety, both Sarah and Michael knew that their situation was still desperate. They were trapped, outnumbered, and cut off from support. Several soldiers were severely wounded and needed immediate medical attention that Sarah couldn't provide with her limited supplies and her own injuries. The enemy fire was getting more accurate, and it was only a matter of time before their position was overrun. That was when Sarah made the decision that would change everything. The decision that would either save them all or cost her everything she held dear. With the situation growing more desperate by the minute, Sarah assessed their options with the cold clarity that her medical training had given her. 7 soldiers were wounded, 3 of them critically. Their defensive position behind the overturned vehicle was providing temporary cover, but the Taliban fighters were moving closer, and their ammunition was running low. Someone needed to get through the enemy lines and reach the third vehicle, where the radio equipment might still be functional. Michael, despite his broken leg and other injuries, had managed to piece together what remained of his communications gear, but the main radio was destroyed, and the backup equipment in the third vehicle was their only hope of calling for reinforcement and medical evacuation. The problem was that reaching that vehicle meant crossing 30 yards of open ground while under heavy enemy fire. "I can make it to the radio," whispered Private Johnson, one of the less severely wounded soldiers. But Sarah could see that his right arm was badly injured, and he was losing blood fast. Even if he made it to the third vehicle, he probably wouldn't have the strength or dexterity to operate the complex communications equipment. Sergeant Martinez had regained consciousness, but was clearly suffering from a severe concussion. His speech was slurred and he couldn't focus his eyes properly. The other wounded soldiers were in various states of shock and injury. None of them were in any condition to attempt the dangerous dash to the radio. Sarah looked at the tactical situation with growing determination. She was injured, but her legs were still functional, and more importantly, she understood basic radio operations from her medical training. She had often coordinated medical evacuations with the communications team, and she knew enough to call for help if she could reach working equipment. "I'm going for the radio," she announced quietly to the group. Michael immediately tried to object, despite his own condition. "Sarah, no. It's too dangerous. Those Taliban fighters have a clear line of sight to that vehicle. You'll never make it." But Sarah had already made up her mind. She had not saved these soldiers from the wreckage only to watch them die from their injuries, while waiting for help that might never come. Someone had to take the risk, and she was the only one physically capable of making the attempt. She began preparing for what might be the longest 30 yards of her life. Using medical supplies from her kit, she quickly fashioned a crude sling for her injured shoulder to prevent further damage during the sprint. She redistributed her remaining medical supplies among the other soldiers so they could provide basic first aid to each other, in case she didn't make it back. Michael watched her preparations, with a mixture of admiration and terror. Over the months of their deployment, he had seen Sarah's courage in the medical tent treating wounded soldiers under rocket attacks without flinching. But this was different. This was deliberately exposing herself to almost certain death for the sake of others. "Sarah," he said quietly, reaching out to touch her hand with his good arm, "if you're really going to do this, you need to know something." She paused in her preparations and looked at him. Even in the chaos of battle, with gunfire echoing around them and the smell of smoke and blood in the air, there was something in Michael's eyes that made her heart skip a beat. "I know we've never talked about it," he continued, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. "I know this isn't the time or place, but I need you to know that these past months getting to know you have been the best part of this whole deployment. You're the strongest, most compassionate person I've ever met, and if we get out of this, I want to spend the rest of my life getting to know you better." Sarah felt tears mixing with the blood and dirt on her face. In the middle of the worst moment of her life, Michael had given her something beautiful to hold on to. She squeezed his hand gently. "Then you better stay alive until I get back," she whispered, "because I feel the same way about you." With that, Sarah began her sprint across the open ground toward the third vehicle. The Taliban fighters spotted her movement immediately, and the air around her exploded with gunfire. Bullets kicked up dust at her feet and whistled past her ears as she ran in a zigzag pattern, using every bit of cover she could find. 20 yards. 15 yards. 10 yards. Sarah could see the third vehicle clearly now, and through its shattered windshield she could see the radio equipment that represented their only hope of survival. But she could also see that the Taliban fighters were adjusting their aim, getting closer with each shot. 5 yards from the vehicle, a bullet grazed her left thigh, sending her stumbling forward. Pain shot up her leg, but adrenaline kept her moving. She dove the final distance, crashing through the vehicle's open door and landing hard on the floor next to the radio equipment. For a moment, she lay there gasping, unable to believe she had actually made it. Then training took over, and she quickly assessed the radio equipment. The main communications array was damaged but functional, and after a few minutes of frantic work, she managed to establish contact with their base. "Base, this is Combat Medic Martinez with Patrol 77 Alpha," she said into the radio, trying to keep her voice steady despite her injuries and the ongoing gunfire outside. "We have multiple wounded and are under heavy enemy fire. Need immediate medical evacuation and close air support." The response from base was immediate and professional. Within minutes, Sarah had provided their exact coordinates, casualty reports, and tactical situation. Apache helicopters were already in the air, and a medical evacuation team was preparing to deploy. Help was coming, but they still had to survive long enough for it to arrive. From her position in the third vehicle, Sarah could see that the Taliban fighters were preparing for a final assault on the wounded soldiers' position. They had been probing the defenses, and now they seemed ready to overrun the makeshift defensive position behind the overturned vehicle. Sarah made another split-second decision that would define her character forever. Instead of staying in the relative safety of the third vehicle, she grabbed the vehicle's mounted machine gun and began providing covering fire for her wounded comrades. The heavy weapon kicked against her injured shoulder with each shot, sending waves of agony through her body, but she kept firing. Her sudden barrage from an unexpected position caught the Taliban fighters off guard, forcing them to take cover and disrupting their planned assault. For 10 crucial minutes, Sarah single-handedly held off the enemy attack, giving her wounded fellow soldiers time to prepare for the final phase of the battle. The sound of approaching helicopters was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever heard. Apache gunships appeared over the ridgeline, their weapon systems immediately engaging the Taliban positions. Within minutes, the enemy fighters were either dead, wounded, or retreating into the mountains. As the medical evacuation helicopters landed and combat medics rushed to treat the wounded, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse. She had done it. She had saved them all. But as the adrenaline wore off and the full extent of her injuries became apparent, she wondered if the cost had been too high. Michael was loaded onto the first medical helicopter, his injuries requiring immediate surgery at the main base hospital. As the helicopter lifted off, he looked down to see Sarah being treated by another medic team. Even from a distance, he could see that she was badly hurt, and he wondered if he would ever get the chance to tell her how her courage had changed, not just his life, but his entire understanding of what it meant to love someone completely. The field hospital at Bagram Air Base buzzed with controlled urgency as wounded soldiers from the ambush were rushed into surgery. Michael was taken directly to the operating room, where military surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair his shattered leg and internal injuries. The bullet fragments and bone damage were extensive, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic about saving his leg and his life. Sarah's injuries were initially assessed as less severe, but as the medical team examined her more thoroughly, they discovered the true extent of what her heroic actions had cost her. The gunshot wound to her thigh had damaged muscle and caused significant blood loss. Her shoulder injury was worse than originally thought, with torn ligaments and possible nerve damage. Most concerning was a head injury from the initial explosion that had gone unnoticed in the chaos of the firefight. For 3 days, both Sarah and Michael drifted in and out of consciousness in the intensive care unit. Sarah's condition remained stable but concerning, while Michael underwent 2 additional surgeries to address complications from his leg injury. Neither was aware of the other's condition, and both fought their own private battles with pain, medication, and the psychological trauma of what they had experienced. The story of Sarah's heroism spread quickly throughout the base and then to military command. Her actions had saved the lives of 7 fellow soldiers, including Michael, and her courage under fire was being recommended for one of the military's highest honors. But Sarah herself was unaware of any of this recognition. She was focused entirely on healing and trying to process the events that had changed her life forever. On the 4th day, Michael regained full consciousness for the first time since the ambush. His leg was immobilized in a complex external fixation device, and the doctors warned him that he faced months of rehabilitation with an uncertain outcome. But his first coherent question was about Sarah. "The medic from our patrol," he asked the nurse who was checking his vital signs. "Sarah Martinez. Is she okay? Where is she?" The nurse, a kind woman from Oregon named Lieutenant Collins, smiled gently. "She's in the ICU, but she's stable. She's been asking about you too whenever she's been awake. The doctors think she'll make a full recovery, but it's going to take time." Michael felt a relief so profound that it made him dizzy. Sarah was alive. She had survived her incredibly brave actions, and she was going to recover. Everything else, his own injuries, the long rehabilitation ahead, the uncertainty about his military career, seemed manageable as long as Sarah was okay. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Sarah was having her own awakening. The medication fog was finally clearing, and she was beginning to remember the events of the ambush with crystal clarity. Every detail was burned into her memory: the explosion, the trapped soldiers, Michael's injuries, her desperate sprint to the radio, and the final firefight that had saved them all. But along with the memories of the battle came something else: the memory of Michael's words before she made her dangerous run to the radio. He had told her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life getting to know her better. Even in the chaos of combat, those words had given her strength and hope. Now lying in a hospital bed with an uncertain future, she wondered if he had meant what he said or if it was just the intensity of the moment talking. Dr. Harrison, the neurosurgeon overseeing Sarah's care, was pleased with her progress. The head injury was healing well, and there were no signs of permanent brain damage. Her shoulder would require physical therapy, but full function should return with time and effort. The leg wound was healing cleanly, and she would likely have only a small scar as a reminder of her heroic actions. "You're a very lucky young woman," Dr. Harrison told her during his morning rounds. "A few inches higher, and that leg wound could have been fatal. Your actions that day were extraordinarily brave, but they easily could have cost you your life. Sarah nodded quietly. She didn't feel brave. She felt like she had simply done what needed to be done, what her training and her conscience had demanded. The idea that her actions were being called heroic seemed strange to her. She had been a soldier doing her job, a medic protecting her patients. On the 7th day after the ambush, both Sarah and Michael were stable enough to be moved out of intensive care. By what seemed like fate but was actually careful planning by Lieutenant Collins, they were assigned rooms across the hall from each other in the recovery ward. It was Collins who finally arranged for them to see each other again. Michael was in a wheelchair when Lieutenant Collins pushed him into Sarah's room. Both of them were pale and bore the obvious marks of their ordeal: bandages, bruises, and the hollow look that comes from facing mortality and barely surviving. But when their eyes met, both of them smiled for the first time since the ambush. "Hey there, hero," Michael said softly, his voice still weak but filled with warmth. "I'm not the hero here," Sarah replied, tears forming in her eyes. "We all just did what we had to do." They talked for hours that first day, processing the events of the ambush and beginning to understand how profoundly the experience had changed them both. Michael told Sarah about his surgeries and the long rehabilitation ahead. Sarah shared her own medical challenges and her concerns about returning to active duty. But beneath the discussion of injuries and recovery was something deeper: the recognition that what they had shared in those moments of crisis had forged a bond that went far beyond friendship. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and their most courageous. They had literally trusted each other with their lives. Over the following weeks, as both soldiers progressed through their recovery, they spent more and more time together. Michael would wheel his chair to Sarah's room every morning, and they would work on their physical therapy exercises together. Sarah helped Michael with the painful process of learning to walk again, while Michael provided emotional support as Sarah dealt with occasional flashbacks and anxiety from the trauma. Their relationship deepened naturally and honestly, built on a foundation of shared experience that few couples could ever understand. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and their fears about how their injuries might affect their military careers. They discovered shared interests in books, movies, and music, but more importantly, they discovered shared values about service, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting others. Lieutenant Collins and the other medical staff watched the relationship develop with approval and gentle amusement. Both Sarah and Michael were model patients, working hard at their rehabilitation and maintaining positive attitudes despite significant challenges. But it was clear to everyone that they were stronger together than either would have been alone. The question that neither Sarah nor Michael wanted to address directly was what would happen when their medical treatment was complete. Michael's leg injury was severe enough that his military career might be over. Sarah's physical injuries were healing well, but the psychological impact of the trauma was still being evaluated. They might both be discharged from the Army and sent back to their respective homes in different states. The uncertainty about their future was complicated by the intensity of their feelings for each other. In the space of a few weeks, they had gone from friendly colleagues to something much deeper. But they were both practical people who understood that decisions made in the emotional aftermath of trauma might not be the same decisions they would make under normal circumstances. As their discharge dates approached, both Sarah and Michael knew they needed to have an honest conversation about what came next. They had found something beautiful and real in the midst of tragedy, but they also needed to face the practical realities of building a life together outside the unique environment where their love had begun. 3 months after the ambush, both Sarah and Michael faced medical evaluation boards that would determine their fitness for continued military service. Michael's leg had healed remarkably well, but he still walked with a slight limp and would never again meet the physical standards required for combat duty. Sarah had recovered almost completely from her physical injuries, but the Army psychologists were concerned about post-traumatic stress symptoms that occasionally surfaced during her evaluations. The decisions came within a week of each other. Michael received a medical discharge with full honors and disability benefits. His military career was over, but he was free to return to civilian life with his health largely intact. Sarah's situation was more complex. She was cleared for limited duty but would be reassigned to a stateside medical facility, far from combat zones. During their final weeks at the military hospital, Sarah and Michael had many long conversations about their future. The intensity of their relationship had not diminished as they healed. If anything, going through rehabilitation together had strengthened their bond and proven that their feelings were based on more than just the trauma they had shared. Michael made the first move toward planning their future together. Using his military laptop, he researched veterinary schools near his family home in Ohio. Sarah had often talked about her dream of becoming a veterinarian, and Michael knew that helping her achieve that goal was something he wanted to be part of. When he presented his research to Sarah, she was touched by his thoughtfulness but also concerned about the practical challenges they faced. "Michael, we barely know each other outside of a war zone," Sarah said one evening as they sat in the hospital garden. "What if we're different people when we're not dealing with life and death situations every day? What if this feeling we have doesn't survive in the normal world?" Michael had thought about the same concerns, but his feelings for Sarah had only grown stronger as he got to know her better during their recovery. "I know it's scary," he replied. "I know we're taking a risk. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I don't think that's just because of what we went through together. I think what we went through together just showed us who we really are." They decided to take things slowly and practically. Michael would return to Ohio and use his military benefits to enroll in college, working toward a degree in business administration. Sarah would complete her military commitment at a medical facility in Texas, close enough to her family that she could help them with the financial struggles that had originally prompted her to join the Army. They would maintain their relationship long distance and see how it developed over time. The night before their respective discharges, Sarah and Michael made promises to each other that went beyond typical romantic commitments. They promised to be honest about their feelings even if those feelings changed. They promised to support each other's dreams and goals, even if pursuing those dreams required difficult sacrifices. And they promised to never take for granted the precious gift of life that they had both nearly lost and somehow managed to keep. Their goodbye at the airport was emotional, but hopeful. Both of them understood that they were embarking on a new kind of adventure, one that might be even more challenging than military service, but potentially much more rewarding. They had saved each other's lives on a battlefield in Afghanistan, and now they were going to see if they could build a life together in peacetime America. The transition to civilian life proved difficult for both of them in different ways. Michael struggled with the physical limitations of his injured leg, and the psychological challenge of finding purpose outside the military structure that had defined his adult life. He enrolled in college classes but often felt disconnected from classmates who had never experienced combat or understood the weight of responsibility that came with military service. Sarah's situation was equally challenging but for different reasons. Her assignment to a military medical facility in San Antonio meant continuing her service but in a safe, routine environment that felt almost surreal after her deployment in Afghanistan. She found herself restless and sometimes anxious, missing the sense of vital purpose that came with combat medicine, while also being grateful for the safety and predictability of her new assignment. They talked every day by phone and video chat, sharing the details of their respective adjustments to new lives. These daily conversations became the anchor point for both of them, a reminder of the connection they had forged and the future they were working toward together. Michael told Sarah about his business classes and his part-time job at a veteran services organization. Sarah shared stories from the medical facility and her growing excitement about applying to veterinary school. 6 months after leaving the military hospital, Michael made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Using his savings and military benefits, he bought a plane ticket to San Antonio to visit Sarah for a long weekend. It would be their first time seeing each other since they had said goodbye at the airport, and both of them were nervous about whether their relationship would feel the same in person. The moment Michael walked through the arrival gate at San Antonio International Airport, all of Sarah's doubts evaporated. The man walking toward her was still the same person who had risked his life alongside her in Afghanistan, still the same person who had supported her through months of painful rehabilitation. He was thinner than before, and the slight limp from his leg injury was noticeable, but his smile was exactly the same smile that had given her strength during the darkest moments of their deployment. They spent 3 days rediscovering each other outside the context of military service and medical recovery. They visited the San Antonio River Walk, toured local museums, and spent hours talking about their dreams for the future. Most importantly, they confirmed that their feelings for each other were real and lasting, not just products of shared trauma or wartime intensity. On Michael's last night in San Antonio, he and Sarah sat on the porch of her small apartment near the base, watching the Texas sunset and talking about their plans. Sarah had been accepted to veterinary school at Ohio State University, which would bring her close to Michael's family home. Michael had been doing well in his business classes and was considering starting his own company providing services to military veterans. "I've been thinking," Michael said as they watched the stars appear in the clear Texas sky. "We've already been through the worst thing that could happen to two people. We've already proven that we can count on each other when everything goes wrong. Maybe it's time to start thinking about what we can build together when everything goes right." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart race. "What are you saying?" Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I'm saying that I don't want to spend another day wondering what our future might look like. I'm saying that I want to marry you, Sarah Martinez. I want to build a life with you that honors what we've been through together and celebrates everything we still have ahead of us." As Sarah stared at the engagement ring that sparkled in the porch light, she realized that this moment was the natural continuation of everything that had begun on that dusty battlefield in Afghanistan. The love that had grown between them through shared danger, mutual sacrifice, and months of supporting each other through recovery was now ready to become something even more permanent and beautiful. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Michael. I want to marry you too." As Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them understood that they were making a commitment that went far beyond what most couples experience. They had already proven their willingness to die for each other. Now they were promising to live for each other, to build something lasting and meaningful from the foundation of courage and love they had discovered in the most unlikely place. The engagement brought new challenges and new joys. Sarah completed her military service and moved to Ohio to begin veterinary school. Michael established his veterans services company, which quickly became successful as word spread about his genuine understanding of the challenges faced by returning soldiers. They found a small apartment near the university and began the daily work of building a life together. There were difficult moments as both of them continued to process the trauma of their combat experience. Some nights Sarah would wake up from nightmares about the ambush, and Michael would hold her until the memories faded. Other times, Michael's leg injury would flare up, causing pain that reminded them both of how close they had come to losing everything. But they faced these challenges together, drawing strength from their shared understanding and their commitment to each other. As their wedding date approached, both Sarah and Michael knew that their marriage would be more than just a celebration of their love. It would be a testament to the power of courage, sacrifice, and hope to transform even the most traumatic experiences into something beautiful and life-affirming. They had saved each other's lives on a battlefield, and now they were ready to spend the rest of their lives proving that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. 2 years after Michael's proposal in San Antonio, the small church in his hometown of Springfield, Ohio, was decorated with white lilies and soft candlelight. The guest list was intimate but meaningful: family members, close friends, and several fellow soldiers who had served with Sarah and Michael in Afghanistan. Among the guests were Sergeant Martinez, who had recovered fully from his head injury, and Lieutenant Collins, the nurse who had helped bring them together during their recovery. Sarah stood in the church's small preparation room, adjusting her simple but elegant wedding dress. She had chosen a design that would accommodate the small scar on her left shoulder, a permanent reminder of the day that had changed everything. Her mother, who had flown in from Texas, was helping with the final touches to her hair and makeup. "Mija, you look beautiful," her mother said, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your father would be so proud if he could see you today." Sarah's father had passed away from cancer during her second year of veterinary school, but she felt his presence strongly as she prepared to marry the man who had become the center of her world. Michael had been incredibly supportive during her father's illness, driving with her to Texas whenever she needed to be with her family, and helping with medical expenses from his growing business. In the church sanctuary, Michael waited at the altar with his best man, his younger brother David, who had recently graduated from college. Michael's injuries from the ambush had healed as well as could be expected, though he still walked with a slight limp that was barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. He wore his dress uniform, as did several of the military guests, creating a scene that honored both their service and their future together. The ceremony began with a processional that included Sarah's maid of honor, her college roommate from veterinary school, followed by Michael's sister Jennifer, who had become close friends with Sarah over the past 2 years. But the moment everyone had been waiting for came when the church doors opened and Sarah appeared, walking down the aisle accompanied by her uncle, who had stepped in to give her away in her father's absence. As Sarah walked toward him, Michael felt the same sense of awe and gratitude that had overwhelmed him on that hospital day, when he first realized she was going to survive her injuries. She was radiant in her wedding dress, but more than that, she embodied everything he had come to love about her: strength, compassion, determination, and a beauty that came from within. The ceremony was conducted by Chaplain Williams, who had served with both Sarah and Michael in Afghanistan and had volunteered to officiate their wedding. His words carried special meaning because he understood the unique bond that had brought them together. "Dearly beloved," Chaplain Williams began, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of two people who have already proven their commitment to each other in the most extreme circumstances imaginable." Sarah and Michael first met in a war zone, where they learned to trust each other with their lives. Today they are making a different kind of commitment, to trust each other with their hearts, their dreams, and their future together. The vows they had written for each other were deeply personal and reflected the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Michael spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "Sarah, on a battlefield in Afghanistan, you risked everything to save my life and the lives of our fellow soldiers. But what you probably don't know is that you saved me in ways that had nothing to do with medical treatment. You showed me what real courage looks like, what selfless love means, and what it feels like to find your other half in the most unexpected place. Today I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the sacrifice you made for all of us that day. I promise to support your dreams, to stand by you in difficult times, and to love you with the same fierce determination you showed when you refused to leave anyone behind." Sarah's vows brought tears to the eyes of nearly everyone in the church, including several tough military veterans who had seen their share of emotional moments. "Michael, when I pulled you from that wreckage, I thought I was just doing my job as a medic, but what I was really doing was saving my future husband, the man who would become my best friend, my strongest supporter, and the love of my life. You've shown me that love isn't just about the dramatic moments. It's about the daily choice to put someone else's happiness before your own. Today I promise to choose you every day for the rest of our lives. I promise to be your partner in building something beautiful from the ashes of everything we've been through together." The exchange of rings was particularly meaningful, as both wedding bands were made from metal, recovered from their unit's vehicles after the ambush. A military jeweler had crafted the rings as a wedding gift, creating something beautiful from the twisted metal that had nearly killed them both. As Chaplain Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. But for Sarah and Michael, the world seemed to pause for a moment as they shared their first kiss as a married couple. It was a kiss that contained all the love, hope, and gratitude they felt for having found each other, and for having survived long enough to reach this perfect moment. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall, decorated with photographs that told the story of Sarah and Michael's relationship. There were pictures from their deployment, carefully selected images that showed happier moments between the dangerous missions. There were photos from their recovery in the military hospital, including one of them working on physical therapy exercises together. And there were pictures from the past 2 years as they had built their civilian life together. Sarah's graduation from veterinary school, Michael's business achievements, and quiet moments that captured the deep contentment they had found in each other. During the reception, several guests gave speeches that honored both the couple's military service and their inspiring love story. Sergeant Martinez spoke about Sarah's heroism during the ambush, noting that her actions that day had allowed him to return home to his own family. Lieutenant Collins shared memories of watching their relationship develop during their recovery, describing how their love had been a source of hope for everyone in the medical unit. But the most moving speech came from David, Michael's younger brother, who had been in high school during Michael's deployment and recovery. When Michael came home from Afghanistan, he was different, David said, his voice carrying across the quiet reception hall. He was quieter, more serious, and he carried something heavy inside him that he couldn't quite share with those of us who hadn't been there. But when Sarah came into his life, I watched my brother become himself again. Not the same person he was before he deployed, but someone stronger and more complete. Sarah didn't just save Michael's life on a battlefield. She saved his heart, his hope, and his future, and now she's part of our family forever. As the evening wound down, Sarah and Michael stepped outside the church into the cool Ohio air. Above them, stars twinkled in the clear sky, reminding them both of that night in San Antonio when Michael had proposed. But this time they weren't looking toward an uncertain future. They were beginning a new chapter of their lives together, built on a foundation of shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and a love that had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable. "Mrs. Thompson," Michael said, taking Sarah's hand as they walked toward their car, decorated with flowers and trailing tin cans. "How does it feel to be married to a wounded warrior with a small business and big dreams?" Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet church parking lot. "It feels like coming home," she said. "It feels like everything we went through was worth it to get us here." As they drove away from the church toward their honeymoon destination, both Sarah and Michael knew that their love story was far from over. They had many years ahead of them to build the life they had dreamed about during those long conversations in the military hospital. Sarah would establish her veterinary practice, specializing in treating animals belonging to military families. Michael would expand his veteran services company, helping other wounded warriors find their way back to civilian life. But they would face whatever came next together, armed with the knowledge that they had already survived the worst that life could throw at them. They had found love in a war zone, nurtured it through trauma and recovery, and transformed it into something beautiful and lasting. Their wedding day was not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a lifetime of proving that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are born from the most unlikely circumstances. The girl who had risked her life to save others on a battlefield had found her happily ever after with the man whose life she had saved, and their love would continue to inspire everyone who heard their story, proving that courage, sacrifice, and hope could triumph over even the darkest moments and create something truly extraordinary.